Okay, so the third part in chapter 4 is kind of the meat of this whole chapter, is understanding decision-making processes by sport participants. And so again, this is all about the consumer behavior behind sport participation. And so this is what we call the decision-making process, and there's basically 5 steps to it. So as you can see here, the decision-making process is the 5-step process that consumers use when deciding to participate in a specific sport or activity, and is the foundation for the model of the sport participant behavior. So it has to be stressed that the primary reason for understanding the participant decision-making process is a guide to the rest of this idea of the strategic sports marketing process. So we understand their behavior, we're better able to understand how we can market to them both the goods and services we offer. And so here's the 5-step process. This 5-step process I'll walk you through here in just a second. And as we go through, there'll be some other terminologies and things to know about. So it's important to understand these 5 steps. And I also want to say before we get into it, this is not universal for every sport consumer. It can be for pretty much any type of participant, but does give us a general understanding or conceptualization of how we can understand the consumer. So the first one is the problem recognition. This is similar to any other type of decision-making process you've probably heard of. It's the key here, or at least the key points here, is that the problem recognition, the first step, is the result of a discrepancy between, and here's, if you want to underline some words here, between a desired state and an actual state. And that gap, or that discrepancy, is large enough and important enough to activate this 5-step process. And so I'll give you an example of myself, and one thing I'm kind of involved in still, but haven't always been in, and that's trail racing. And what I mean by trail racing, that's running on trails, so not concrete, but hiking trails for longer distances. The furthest I've ever done is a 25K, but I hadn't always done that. When I went to my old job at a previous university, I didn't have a whole lot of contact with my colleagues, other professors, and decided that I wanted to. So I wanted to become more involved, get to know people, but also be physically active. And so there was a discrepancy between the state of me not being very social or physically active to the actual state of me being physically active and social with my colleagues. And so that's where problem recognition came in. I knew there was something. So in other words, the customer realizes that they have a need that is not currently being met. So this is important to us as sports marketers for a couple of reasons. First, we have to understand what sports people actually want. Let's say you're working for a community parks and recreation department. The offerings that you have for both youth and adult are important to understand because it gives you a perception of what the community wants and actually able to offer those needs. It's also important to understand what their need is. Is their need for social interaction? Is their need for a third place, a place that's not work and not home, something they can get away from? Is it just being physically active at a moderate or low level? And the types of offerings that you have to meet the needs and wants of those consumers. So once we've recognized there's a problem, this process obviously is not conscious. You don't always go through this process going, okay, now I finished step 1 as a consumer, what's the next step? But a good understanding of behavior then leads us to this information search. An information search is essentially when the participant looks for information, tries to figure out what offerings are out there and what type of information can help with this. This is where electronic word of mouth, e-technologies that help us as marketers learn more about a consumer, but also provide information is important. So once we've recognized that there's a problem in step 1, we now try to find information to solve that problem. And so there's 2 basic sources of information. The first source is internal, and the second source is external. Now, if you want to put a note, we're going to talk about in the next part internal and external, as well as situational factors that influence this entire process. This is different. We're talking here about internal and external sources of information. And so internal sources of information will be your own experiences. So maybe when I was a kid, I played soccer. Whenever I was a kid, I played baseball. And that is going to either positively or negatively influence my behavior in the future. So looking at childhood memories, looking at family emphasis, looking at what I did in college, blah, 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 blah. All of those things are my own experiences that impact both positive and negative. The external sources of information are typically those that we as sports marketers have some or complete control over. So for example, external sources would be our environment. So first of all, our social. Now, do we have any control over our word of mouth, what people say about us? Well, indirectly we might. We might be able to start conversations on social media, find our fans, essentially find our ambassadors that will talk about how great the program is that we offer. But also it's just monitoring what people are saying so that we can solve the problems that may arise or highlight the benefits. Second is marketing messages. This is obviously something us as marketers can control, telling people about the different offerings we have and why it's beneficial to them. And the last one is experiential sources. And so this comes from me watching. So for example, this is kind of where I came back to this trail racing. I didn't run a whole lot. I mean, up to that point, most I've ever run was 5 miles. And it was a while ago, so I did have some internal sources of running. Never really did a whole lot of trail running, but I did have experience with hiking, and I really enjoyed the outdoor nature of it. At the same time, my social surrounding, or my environment, my external sources of information included people talking about it, so the social aspect, as well as experiential sources, and that I saw somebody participating in the activity. And so experiential sources are participants seeing other people participate in an activity and learning more about it. Okay. So now we've gathered all this information, we have to evaluate what's most important to us. This is the evaluation of alternatives. So in here we're looking at this idea of the evoked set and evaluation criteria. So it's important for us to understand two implications. First, that there is a desired inclusion. So what we call this is an evoked set. I'll talk about this in a second. When we use this evoked set or groups of sports that we might want to participate in, and a set of evaluation criteria to decide whether or not we're going to participate in it. So for example, let's look at the evoked set. When I was looking to participate with people that I worked with and become more physically active, there were a lot of options. I could have played employee basketball. I could have gone and worked out in the fitness center and hoped that there was people around me doing the same. I could have joined a group fitness class like a spinning or a Zumba or something like that. Or I could have, for example, done trail running and biking or things like that. That group of sports or activities that I find interesting based on my information search lead up to what we call the evoked set. And so when I look at consumer behavior, this evoked set is the items that are given the most important or given the greatest consideration. So once I have that evoked set, then I use an evaluation criteria. In other words, how the customer picks what sport to participate in. Remember, this goes back to problem recognition. So I knew there was a discrepancy between my desired state and my actual state. And so therefore, I knew what was missing, something social and something physically active. Of that evoked set, I personally decided trail running because it was with my friends and colleagues that I wanted to be a part of, and it was something that was physically active, something that I enjoyed. So this led to participation. Obviously, I've looked at my evoked set against my evaluation criteria and decide participation is what I want to do. So this is the action. And there's a lot of things that can influence this. We'll talk about those 3 factors that influence the participant's decision-making process. But some things are internal, some things are external, and some things are situational, things that we can't always get. So for example, some examples of things that might prevent this action or participation: the weather, our friends, meaning they're friends that we like, or friends that we're no longer friends with, whether or not they participate or not, my family, commitments, motivation I have to exercise. All of this can be fleeting or can be more concrete and long-term. But anyway, all of these types of activities or participation will be influenced by these different ideas or factors. The last step of all of this is our post-participation evaluation. Essentially what we do here is evaluate whether it was a good idea or not. And that's what we call cognitive dissonance. It's when people question whether their choice was a good one. It is looking back on, okay, now that I participated in trail running, is this something I really enjoy? If the answer is yes, then I'm going to continue to do it. If it's not, guess what? They go back to, there's a problem. So the whole 5-step process starts over again. And so this is essentially the evaluation of participation. Was it a good activity? Self-reflection. And many times sports marketers need to understand that this is a very important part of our job as marketers. Once we get them in the door is not when the marketing is done, it's keeping them there. let them know, okay, remind them of why this is beneficial and what they like about it. And so that is the 5-step decision-making process.